Today we're diving into a story that's got it all: war, resistance, courage, and one remarkable woman who stood at the center of it: Genevieve de Gaulle, the niece of the famous Charles de Gaulle. I had the opportunity to speak to Paige Bauer, author of the book General's Niece, the first English biography on Genevieve de Gaulle. Genevieve de Gaulle is a fascinating character. Her uncle's, of course, super famous, but she herself created her own legacy. She fought tyranny, she smuggled documents, she survived the horrible Nazi women's camp. This story is absolutely incredible, and I for sure know you're going to enjoy this interview. But before we start, if you clicked on this video, I know you're into history, so I created a list of 100 history books that will change your life. Links in the description, it's completely free. Let's start the interview.
She's a bit like her uncle in the sense that she was passionate about history, passionate about words, um, and had been raised in a family that had certain ideas of, what a good French person should do and be. That she was a person that discussed literature, that, probably would have made a fine lawyer, given her talents. Um, but she was the oldest of 4 kids, who, faced some tragedy early in life. She lost her beloved mother at the age of 4 and a half, and after that, kind of became her father's emotional support because he was just devastated, and understandably so. So she became like his emotional support, her siblings' surrogate mom for a time. She would if her brother wouldn't study, she'd whack him with a comb or beat him up with a Latin dictionary or, all the good things we do when we're looking after younger siblings. So she was quiet in a sense, but she had this inner fire. The second tragedy she faced before her 18th birthday was the loss of her beloved sister Jacqueline. And, there's the she had a bit of survivor's guilt about that. So you've got this young woman who's seen a lot, been through a lot, and has this touch of an old soul in her already before she is really technically what anyone might consider to be old. So that her father, who was, brilliant and sensitive, you know, he he kinda shaped this young woman into, what she was becoming, which was someone who looked around her at the world, saw things, that, you know, resonated with her, but also saw things that, did not, and that she thought were she had a very strong sense of right and wrong. And so there you are, 18, she's already been through a lot, and that kinda set the stage for what would come next.
Yeah, because you also see the same as in like the type of upbringing in her father's upbringing, right? As in
Yes,
all the uncles, the aunties, they all have the same type of upbringing.
exactly. Yeah, where you're expected to sit down around the dinner table and talk about Homer or talk about, you know, uh, what you've read, what current events are. You're expected to kind of understand where you're from and why it's important in the larger scheme of things.
Mm.
And a lot of people aren't raised like that anymore. I think it
No, I
depends on the
mean,
family, but I think a lot of people aren't raised like that anymore.
no, there's
But
no
you
way
also
you can. If you ask me to recite a poem of Homer, I'm done for.
yeah. So, these were people who were strong in their faith. They had a deep sense of their nation's history, and a sense of how things should be. Like they knew what they believed in, they knew what they stood for, and That was the through line, at least in these generations of De Gaulle's.
Hmm. And would you say like her understanding of history also inspired the type of way she eventually decided to live?
I think so, because she understood, France's really storied, past, and then when, France capitulated to they signed the armistice with the Nazis, that was a huge disgrace. Like, you when she heard, Marshal Philippe Pétain speak on the radio saying, "We need to stop fighting." She couldn't even believe that it was Pétain. She thought, "This can't be, like, this person who told us to continue the fight during World War One, to, to fight like we've never fought before. Now he's telling us to put down our guns. This can't even be him. This can't be real." I guess in its time, what the kids talk about today, the deep fake. This has got to be, some strange circumstance. This is unreal. And, her father had to say, "Yeah, well, I'm sure, I know you're devastated, but it's true. It's true. It is real. And we have to stop the fighting." It was her uncle that stepped in to fill that void, to remember, to encourage people to not give up the fight, to either join him in London where he, was in exile, or to figure out how to do something, which was what they called resisting on the ground back in France. A lot of people did not hear, General de Gaulle's speech on the BBC. It was very limited, but, they started talking about it. It was kind of like an avalanche, and as neighbors began feeling comfortable to speak to each other about what was going on and try to figure out, where do they stand in the whole, scheme of things, like should we just sit down and take this or should we fight? As people became more comfortable, that's when you started seeing whatever act of like this sense of the resistance come to the fore.
Because I think it's important to remember that in the beginning, the goal wasn't the goal we know, like
No,
right now. Like the
no,
popularity wasn't the same. So
absolutely
I
not.
can imagine maybe during the early years of the war, the De Gaulle name was maybe a bad thing to maybe even have. Like it could work against you. Like what did that look like for her?
I think at the point in time when he was, one of the things that he was doing was trying to establish himself as a writer and a thinker and a military strategist. And one of the things that he wrote about that the French military didn't use is the exact concept of what we've come to know as the Blitzkrieg. Which was the Nazis saw some wisdom in, but the French military didn't want any part of. They wanted to stay in their own, like, but he was trying to give, in his role at the time in the French military, he was trying to get people to fight back against the Nazis, to not, stop fighting. And, you know, because he was resisting the tide, he realized that he had to leave and fight from elsewhere. And because of that, he was persona non grata in France. He was labeled a traitor.
Mm.
And, you know, as the war went on and as people began to hear about him more, to be a De Gaulle was there's one story I write about in the book about Genevieve. Was She had some documents and some other items that she had concealed that she was going to pass to someone else in the resistance. And the Nazis took her off the train and they began interviewing her. and they found a picture of her uncle, which they told her was illegal. And it's both a scary anecdote, but it's also kind of a funny anecdote because she stood her own against these Nazis and said, "Well, why wouldn't I have a picture of my own uncle?"
Mm. Yeah.
And it's this back and forth for a while where they realize, yeah, it really is kind of absurd that we're that we find ourselves here, um, arresting a young woman for having a picture of a family member. But the tension there is, he was this resistance figure, this figure that was pushing back against the Nazis in that moment. And they said, "Okay, go get back on the train." And she said, "No, you pulled me off this train. I had to, I fought really hard to get this ticket. You're gonna take me right back on the train."
When in the war does she start showing that she's trying to fight back in some form of way? Because it obviously doesn't start like instantly with attacking. It starts with like little disrespects towards the Nazi soldiers, I can
Yeah,
imagine.
it began, pretty much the summer that the war, is the summer of the occupation that it began. She gets so tired of seeing Nazi soldiers in her town that, they were required to salute them, that she would turn her back on them rather than salute them. So it was little subtle acts like that. And then it grew to, tearing down Nazi placards, cutting out little tiny crosses of Lorraine, the symbol of resistance. And then going out after curfew late at night to tear down a Nazi flag and bring it back to her house, under cover of darkness. Um, there was a time when she said, "I almost hesitate to bring these little things up because they seem kind of silly in the larger realm of things, but they were a start. They were a place to start. They were a place to show yourself and others, that I don't stand with or for this." And I think that built confidence once you see what you can do, what you can get away with. Then you try to build on that,
Hmm.
and you find yourself working or moving toward like-minded people who are setting up networks to do these larger things.
Mm. And the network you're talking about right now is a network from the secret newspaper, correct?
Correct. Défense de la France was a resistance newspaper that was run out of the Sorbonne on this large printer. And what happened, they would do the network itself would do these things like bring false, IDs to people, other kinds of documents like that, pass intelligence, all these sorts of things. But I also ran this newspaper that shared with the French what was happening outside of like in the real world. It did not spread Nazi propaganda. It fought back against that. It also, because the resistance was kind of fractured at this point in time, there were different, cells throughout France. This one, once Genevieve joined this one, she is able to get them behind or in support of her uncle in London. And she wrote under the name Galia to talk about, why her alias was Galia, which is means France. And she wrote about her uncle and why her uncle was someone you should be supporting and what he had to bring to France. So that was a big part of what she started doing. They would go into, the subway and distribute these papers kind of quietly and stealthily as they could. They would stand outside of churches and give them out to parishioners after a service. And they did what they could to spread the word. Prior to that, she was also dipping her toe in at her aunt's house. She was staying with her aunt in Paris, and her aunt was beginning to do resistance work. And on a like, this interim level, no one knew what Charles de Gaulle looked like. So they had all these pictures printed of him that they slipped into little fused paperbacks, and they sent them throughout France, but by sticking them in in the paperbacks, that was the way that they could get them past Nazi censors. That's the way they could
Mm.
spread the word they were trying to spread.
And would they like copy the pictures or send them like originals?
They would copy pictures and stick them into little used newspapers, or I mean, sorry, paperbacks that they bought
Mm-hmm.
from bouquinistes along the Seine, and send them out across the country. What was interesting, terrifying, was one night, she was trying to stuff these books with her uncle's picture, and the Gestapo showed up. And she had a room that was just a mess with all these pictures, and she knew that if the Nazi soldier or if the Gestapo caught her, um, it would be real, real trouble. And so here's a story about, her inviting them in and playing it nonchalant and said, "Oh, my aunt's not here right now. Would you like a drink?" She was very hospitable. And then it was she was doing what she could to distract them as she ran back and forth, trying to burn the pictures that she was stuffing into these books. And by the time her aunt got back, by the time the Gestapo searched the house, um, all the pictures were burned. The only thing left were these smoking embers from the fireplace. But this is, a little act, big act, whatever it is. It comes to this point when anyone who is trying to fight back against the Nazis was really a blue panel. That same evening, her aunt was taken away for questioning overnight. She was returned, like, the next morning, but there was that sense, like, we might never see her again. And then 19-year-old, 20-year-old Geneviève de Gaulle would not only be, trying to do what's right to fight back, but she'd be raising her aunt's kids, you know, um somebody loses a mother, someone loses an aunt, someone loses a wife. You never knew what the day would bring.
Hmm. Yeah, but what you just mentioned with like the little thing and the big thing, I think like underestimating the little thing, I think that's a dangerous thing to do because even like hope, like it gets spread. Like, okay, you give a picture to one person and that person inspires five other people. Is five. Well, you can just keep on going.
Yeah.
So I think it's also one thing that I was also thinking about while reading your book is that we often see the war as in like, okay, we know it's going to end around 1945. But
Mhm.
like in that moment for her, like she didn't know if it
No.
was going to end between now, 10 years, 20, 30.
Yeah.
So in order to be courageous, that must have been like really, really hard.
It's huge because, especially in those early days, they didn't know what was gonna happen. They didn't know how long it was gonna last. Um, and yes, you can't pass judgment on little thing versus big thing. What it became about, it was a choice. It goes back to this way that she was raised. What kind of person do I want to be? What sort of France do I see? Do I envision? Do I want? And what can I do um, to show who I am and what I value to help my country?
Uh-huh.
Uh, it starts with a flag or it starts with whatever it starts with. People did what they did. Everyone made different choices at that time to rattle their oppressor. It snowballed into something. It certainly did.
It's often like overestimated how many people were resisting, right? Especially in the beginning.
Yeah. And I think, depending on how you choose to see it, I think that that's more of it. It depends on what you define as resistance?
Mm-hmm.
Is it cutting out, crosses over Lorraine and throwing them off the top of a building? Or is it blowing up a railway? Is it stuffing books with your uncle's picture? There's different levels of it. And depending on what you define as resistance, those numbers
Yeah.
shift. But the acts themselves, the networks themselves, the people who are fighting back, whatever says it was, they play a significant role in trying to help the Allies, you know, come in and understand where like German fortifications were. Um, they helped uh, take downed pilots, sneak them out of the country to safety. Um, and so, size or not, they were still doing very big, very heroic things that contributed to the overall cause.
Mm. And the newspaper that she was a part of, was it able or was it trying to give like secret messages to the Allies, or was it pure for just the French people
I
to
think it was
inform
mostly
them?
for the French. I think it was
Okay,
mostly for the French. Yeah.
okay. And for how long did she was she a part of that newspaper until she eventually got caught?
Um, it was a couple of years,
Oh,
and
okay.
then she was going to a bookstore to drop some falsified documents off to a source.
Mm-hmm.
And, that was where, this rogue cop caught her and turned her over to the Nazis for deportation.
Yeah, that was probably maybe the most interesting part of your book. That part of like the thing she had to withstand. It was incredible. What I also found interesting is what happened to the guy that arrested her, because he was French too, right?
Right. He wound up being caught too because at the end, post-war, no one's going to arrest a De Gaulle and turn them over to the Nazis, and then when the tide turns, not be as held accountable for it, and that's certainly what happened.
And for her, she eventually gets caught and she gets sent to where exactly in the beginning?
To Ravensbrück, concentration camp, it was the only, women's only concentration camp in, Germany. It was 50 miles north of Berlin. It was across the a lake from a little quaint town, and it was nestled in this beautiful forest with the shimmering lake and so forth. So it was, you know, the area had been hit really hard by the Great Depression. So by 1938, when Heinrich Himmler decided we need to not be punishing women the same way as men, he they found this spot. They started building the camp, and because the area was pretty economically devastated, they started advertising jobs the way one would, promising great benefits and a wonderful apartment, and so forth. And these people came from this beautiful little town across the lake to come over and work in this horrific environment. So people like Geneviève de Gaulle, people were rounded up where they were, held in France for a period of time, and then crammed into or train cars together and shipped off to these camps. There's some documentation that says that Geneviève like needle pointed the journey along on the back of a bread ration bag, so she could see where she was going. And they arrived in the middle of the night, um, so you could be run through this village in the middle of the night. No one would know you were there. No one would see you. You arrive outside the gates of Ravensbrück and you began to see, "Oh my goodness, I've come all this way. I'm starving, I'm cold, I'm dirty, and I'm going to a concentration camp." and, she saw these, um, thin, skeletal figures, these women who had been held there, and she realized that this was her fate. And so, they were held outside in the cold for hours at a time. They were stripped naked. Their possessions, their dignity, all of this was taken from them, and they were put to work, no matter um, what state they were in. Because keep in mind, their rations were small even prior to getting there. Um, they were worked, you know, to the bone. No matter what state they were in, they were expected to get up at 3:30 in the morning every day, rain or shine, hot or cold, make their beds quickly and very, precisely, get what passed for coffee. It is described as brown sugary water, and go out to be counted every day. They'd line everybody up in a courtyard. They would count. If the count was off, they'd have to start over again. This could go on for hours. Someone falls down, they kick them, whip them, you know, uh, and that was before you even got to the brutal manual labor of digging up, creating roads, shoveling coal, going through old Russian uniforms or German uniforms to clean them up. Their severed hands would fall out. They smelled filthy. They were full of lice. All of this. That was the hell that you were living in. And yet, these women, no matter what they were going through, they found ways to retain what humanity they could. They'd pick lice out of their friends' hair. They would sing songs to each other, recite scripture, do what they could just to make it that hint more tolerable.
Hmm. Yeah, they found the whatever positive you could find in that type of environment. Like she laughed a lot, right? She was known for being funny.
She was very funny. Yeah, she was very funny. What we might call sassy a little bit, and you had to find humor wherever you could. We had to. Um,
Yeah.
so
And also friendships, right? Because that's what I liked. Like he also went quite in depth on the story of her friends.
her friends were, resistors too. There was one of them was an acclaimed anthropologist who worked for a museum in France. She, was one of them who was writing down notes about what happened. In the camps. She kept little secret notebooks where she wrote about torture or starvation or the numbers of people on a day-to-day basis, so she really kept track of this, meticulously. Um, there were others, Mies Christel-Bonet, who I was fortunate to meet because she spoke German, she could listen to what was happening and understand it and relay it back, to Germaine Thion, who was the anthropologist in question. So they banded together. They knew that the circumstances that they were in, someone would need to keep track of what was going on because ultimately history would show we needed to know. We needed to know, and we needed to never forget what happened there. So hopefully it would not be repeated. So they had this sense of mission. They had this sense of sisterhood that began there, but went it reached through the rest of their lives, um, and they had this sense of dedication.
To you, what is like your favorite story from that period of like the sisterhood of the women helping each other and truly like helping each other in probably the most difficult moment of their each other's lives.
The lengths they would go to prevent someone from being sent to the gas chamber, you know, um, hiding in the trying to hide in the ceiling of one of the barracks to avoid, being hauled away. These women were so brave, so strong in the face of such evil, and they still managed to find that tenderness, which is no small feat under the circumstances.
To me, like one of my favorite stories was that she got a birthday cake, right,
Yeah.
for her birthday.
Yes. Yeah.
She was in what was it, in confinement for quite
Right.
a while, and
Mhm.
then she came back, and her friends made her a birthday cake for her birthday.
Right. There's that, how do we pass the time? There's plenty of documents showing that they created their own playing cards. Um, there's one, it's a little macabre, but Genevieve de Gaulle would have cockroach races. Some might say, "Oh, that's a little gross." But no, you do what you can do to pass the time and find something to pull for, no matter what it is. Some wrote operas, like operas about satirical operas about what happened in the camps. They daydream about food. When I get out, I'm gonna have this, because they didn't have anything really.
Hmm.
So
Yeah. And do we know anything about her maybe lowest moments she was maybe thinking about giving up?
she got very, very sick while she was in the camp. Very, very sick, very frail. Um, um, that was definitely one of her lowest moments. She didn't think she could make it. She ultimately wound up being set aside as a hostage in a prisoner swap. She was put aside for that. So that was what being Dadal's niece um, helped her get out of, the camp. And then after that, I mean, it was the calamity of tromping through the snow in the dead of night with an American prisoner, um, being fired on, being interrogated again and again and again before released, to a place where she could rest and ultimately come back to France.
Because there was a moment a little earlier, right, that de Gaulle was offered an exchange with her,
Yeah,
but de Gaulle said no. It
right.
kind of reminded me of Stalin. I think Stalin did the
Yeah,
same thing with his son.
yeah.
So he didn't want to do that, de Gaulle, because I mean it isn't fair on the rest of the
Right.
civilized.
It's yeah,
Yeah. Mm.
because there's certainly other people in there who could have been part of the swap, and why should she have the privilege?
Yeah. That's very. You can tell that their childhood really stick by that. That's probably something they learned as a
Yeah,
kid,
yeah,
like those type of morals.
right.
Mm. Like, because that's the thing too, right? Like during her camp, like most of the moments, like no one really knew who she was, right? Like the guards. And she kept that a secret. Did she do that on purpose, or didn't she want benefits? Like,
I think she just wanted to be seen as one of them.
mm,
I don't think she wanted any special privileges. I don't think she wanted any special treatment or for people to see her as anything other than who she was as an individual. Um, Certainly the name came up before. It had come up. But I think ultimately, she had the respect of people in the camp. She had nurtured the friendships, and she was seen more as Genevieve than anything else.
so eventually she gets free, and what happens then?
She was in terrible health. A lot of people who were released from the camps were. And when she was brought back to France, as others were, they're inundated with questions. What have you been through? How did they beat you? What did they use to beat you? And it took a while for her to get her feet back under her. She was actually prior to that, she met a woman in Switzerland, or she was at the time convalescing before her return. And they understood together that women, especially when they returned to France or post-war women period, there was really going to be a lot of real need there. um, healthcare. Healthcare was going to be a major need. It's in a lot of cases shelter. A lot of these women who were coming back in such terrible shape, their homes had been destroyed in the war. They lost husbands. Um, they had no income, you know, and they were coming back to a France that was trying to rebuild as they were trying to rebuild their own lives. So she created a post-war group, kind of a mutual aid society of sorts, where they had this grand mission of providing all these services to women internees, the healthcare, clothes, shelter, food. They had a tea room. They had just kind of mental health support, but they didn't have the funds, so they'd have these fundraisers and so forth. So these things could be created. This group found a building near the Jardin de Luxembourg in Paris, um, had these weekly meetings. They'd have people come in and sing Mozart, anything to kind of provide some aspect of beauty after all they had been through. They'd have discussions about, what their lives were like after the war, what they were worried about. And ultimately what they started doing was creating again, it's another journalistic organ. They created this newsletter called Voix et Visage, voices and faces. Because like a lot of times, when you were in the camps, you could hear people's voices but not see them. And so what was interesting to me, this is you can find it now online. It's been digitized. You see what these women are concerned about. You see the great, they're talking about healthcare that they needed. They talk about they brought a doctor in to help these women free of charge. And they made a real effort to try to remember everyone that they had lost in the camps. So they wrote stories about these women, so that they could be preserved for posterity. In a way, it was kind of like a very serious women's magazine. You had art, you had poetry, you had um, topical news that was relevant to the people who got the newsletter. This group that she was helped found and that she remained involved with for the rest of her life, it really provided a lot of support, um, and kind of a political sense to these women. It gave them the sense of what to fight for. They had just fought for so much, and yet they had to fight to reestablish themselves after the war too.
Do we know anything about her political standpoints?
People certainly wanted her to run for office once she got back, but I think that, this group that she founded it required a lot of time. Um, Her relationships with these friends that she made, in the camps, really sustained her, and it was really mostly a matter of talking about what happened in the camps, which she did a lot. She did a lot of speeches after the war, working with this group, to help women get back on their feet and find support, and really helping people not forget what happened there.
Everyone always talks about the general, but I'm happy that she's still remembered. She lived a beautiful life for sure, and I
Really?
think
Yeah,
she will inspire people for hundreds of years to come.
I hope so. I certainly did. She was a petite person who packed a big punch with her thought, with her action, with her words, um, and with her political engagement. And I'm not talking about elected office, and I'm talking about, what she did for others, because that's still political. She was a testament to, her family, the way they raised people, the way they nurtured people. And she's certainly worthy of our time and attention.